I'm here with John Ramdeen and Robin Black, and we do have a main event for UFC 200 on July the 9th. The rematch is set. Daniel Cormier and Jon Jones for the undisputed light heavyweight championship. And now that it seems that the Conor McGregor saga has been put to the side, how has the UFC handled this in your estimation, John, looking at the card that is now in place? And Dana White also stating that they are not done with the construction of this card.
Yeah, I mean, from the fan standpoint, of course, we all wanted to see the rematch with Conor and Nathan Diaz. That's no longer an option. You have to try to put some of the biggest fights that you can possibly put on. I think the main event now with Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier, considering all the stuff that's happened, the bad blood, I think you've got a great story. You have two of the highest level fighters on the UFC's roster. I think this fight makes sense. The UFC 200 fight card, the International Fight Week, I think it's going to have a great cherry on top with the main event between Jon Jones and Daniel Cormier. And Jon Jones maybe looking past Daniel Cormier because he says once he gets rid of DC for this fight at UFC 200, the goal is to have Anthony Johnson in November.
He was playing with him. He was saying things intended to get under his skin. Pollock showed us a tweet he sent out saying, make sure you boo this guy because it really bothers him. He's playing with him, and it's smart. And Cormier tries to put some chips back in the game, too. I mean, the mental aspect of this game between these two is real, and it's in play. But when you get into a cage for those 25 minutes, really all of that steps aside. They're both standing there. They're both looking at each other. They're both holding belts. They're both saying stuff. But in the end, they got to get in the cage. They've done it once before, and Jones won 4 of those 5 rounds. He won most of the different ranges. He really took that fight. So it's Cormier who has to make some changes.
As you look at how this thing has all played out, I mean, from just a pure strategy standpoint, I think the UFC, involved with everything involving Conor McGregor, I mean, it's hard to look at this as anything but a pretty much a shutout by the UFC in terms of how they handled this. Are they going to make as much money on that particular night as they would have with Conor McGregor? No, they won't. But as Robin, you outlined, Conor McGregor is going to fight again. He's going to end up on one of these cards, and I think this was a real eye-opener to when the UFC is firm in their stance. I mean, look at the different options they had. Look at all the options after UFC 200. We forget about the fact that Nick Diaz is going to be eligible to fight shortly after that time. You have Nate Diaz that now needs a card. You have New York. You have Ronda's return. Forgotten in all of this last week was George St-Pierre saying that he wants to see if he's going to be ready for a comeback. I mean, this was really a case of looking at all the different chips the UFC can play. And Conor McGregor challenged that, and now he is on the outside looking in at what probably could have been the biggest payoff of his career fighting at UFC 200 because of all the added promotion that card will get.
Maybe, but I mean, he's the star. Everybody, when Conor's next fight is signed, that is going to be destination one for anybody that is a fan of combat sports. And for a lot of the mainstream audience, too, this is a fight they need to see. It's one of those fights that creates so much interest that even if you're not a hardcore fight fan, you have to see some of the things that Conor's involved in. My question is, one of the reasons why he said he wasn't going to do the press conferences is because he has to focus on fighting. He has to focus on Nathan Diaz. What type of commitments is Conor going to do? Is he going to deal with the UFC? Is he going to do all the press that he needs to if they sign this fight for Nathan Diaz for UFC 202, UFC 203? Is he going to be traveling all over the world? Because as the UFC said, as Dana White said, he's obligated to do this.
Well, and how many are all the deals out in the public? I mean, that to just minimize this was over a series of press conferences with the amount at stake. It's hard to believe that we have seen all angles of this story of what has gone on.
Very true. And think of it. You got to do all of this work to promote UFC 200. I mean, did you guys see these guys dancing on, what was it, USA this morning or something?
Good Morning America.
Good Morning America. These guys all had to be standing up, dancing around, and Frankie looked like he did not want to be there. It's part of the gig, and that's a part of the gig for UFC 200. If Conor goes, I want to talk to my Irish friends here. I am an honorary Irishman. I've been asked not to do the accent anymore, so I won't. But to my Irish friends, you don't have to go to UFC 200 now. You can go to 202 or 203 or whichever one it is in mass and turn that into your own UFC 200. And the UFC understands this. Conor won't have to do all this promotion for UFC 202 or 203. He can use the face Twitter Insta machines and just get people excited London, the Irish will come over to celebrate their hero fighting at UFC 202 or 203. UFC will make a bunch of money. He won't have to do all that promo. He can concentrate on all of his game planning and all of his preparation. Nate Diaz can show up and make a ton of money, and UFC 200 takes a small hit. 202 gets a huge extra boost, and New York comes along, and oh man, the UFC, we often will sit there and go, why did they make this decision? Why is Dana doing that? These are the smartest minds in the promotion game. We see one angle or two angles, or we react to one thing that they see. We don't see the 50 spinning plates that they're doing. These are the smartest minds in promotion. They know what they're doing.
As you look at UFC 200 as it currently stands, Dana White noted in the press conference there will be no adjustment of the ticket prices that are going on sale. Where do you peg this on pay-per-view? Certainly, you get a better sense the week of and the momentum a card has, but as we're a few months out, is this one that hits $1 million? Does it appreciably surpass that number?
Well, I think you and I were talking about it during the press conference, and especially with the UFC hype machine, they've got 3 fights. The entire international fight week, you have Eddie Alvarez fighting RDA, and then this rematch. Again, the viz that they have, the stories that they're going to be able to tell. You have Misha on the card.
And the fact it's 200.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's a number, but it's something that is meaningful.
And people will feel that it's special because of that, and that everybody, the UFC was trying their best because Conor wasn't involved. Because essentially they could have said, you know what? We're giving you 2 title fights. That's it. That's a pretty big fight card. Instead, the UFC wanted to give the fans more. They wanted to make it more special. And I think if you're not going to have Conor involved, I think this is the fight to give to the fans to make it feel special, because this is the fight I think most people were hoping to see upon Jon Jones' return.
It has taken me a long time to get it through to my noggin that promotion and hype and all of this kind of stuff and like rivalries and conflict is important to get people to watch fighting. But I get it now. I get it. This is how the story gets told. And when you see it played out in the public like this, you can see that it gets momentum and gets people involved. You know who's going to watch? Eddie Alvarez versus Rafael dos Anjos. All the dummies of the world that are obsessed with fighting like me. We're all going to watch that. But how do you get more people who kind of have a little potpourri of different entertainment things that they like? How do you get them? You get them with hype and you get them with marketing. Yeah. Conor's good at it. Jon Jones is good at it, but the UFC is the best in the world at it. They're probably the best promoter in history.
And I think we see that now, that International Fight Week, as much as anything, they are very much trying to package this as a whole that you're buying into. And the hope is that, one piece falls out, even the most important piece, it's still a giant collective, and that the person in Ireland, that maybe they're deciding not to travel to Vegas for this, they look at all of the stuff that's on the table, and yes, we've lost the stake, but look at what else is on the table with 5 title fights, all the different stars. And it's hooking people and selling them as much on the branding and all the different pieces involved, as opposed to letting it be contingent on one person falling out and it's a house of cards.
But again, you lose the Irish contingent that weekend. Many of them say, no, we're going to go watch Conor, and you gain them a month and a half later. This game, they understand it, man. They understand it on a level that most promoters have never understood it. And you have to say that honestly. When you're like, it's not fair to the fans that Conor's not there. He can look in the camera and go, we'll have him 2 months later. This promotion understands the game. All I want to do is watch great fights. Yeah. And if I get frustrated that I don't get to see Conor fight Nate at this time, I'll probably, and look at this is what my people do. This is what, I'm an honorary one, but this is what my people do. And they'll do it 2 months later. And you'll lose a couple thousand crazies at the MGM Grand, but you'll get them 2 months later going crazy like this. Our own Wei Ting caught this footage after Conor. Was it when he laid out Aldo? No, it was when he beat Frankie. Or Chad, he hasn't fought Frankie yet. Bing. But man, it's just nonstop good fights. And when you mention George and you see how much more there is, it's going to be a crazy year.
So as we kind of transition back to the fight involving Cormier and Jon Jones, I know, Robin, you had already broke this down extensively ahead of UFC 197, and then it fell apart. But in studying this fight very much in depth, I mean, what do you see as some of the keys that you're curious about seeing from Daniel Cormier the second go-around?
It's when you look at fighting over the last year or so, and we can go back to Holly Holm versus Ronda Rousey as a really concrete example of it. Distance management and range manipulation is the big change in fighting. If we see Stephen Thompson beat beat Hendricks, and when we see them fight for the first time, it's about range manipulation and distance management. When you see Jon Jones, and we saw it against OSP, he owns the outside range. Then when you try to get in closer, he'll push all the way into the inside range. I got my breakdown. I'm going to reshoot it this week where we'll break down in detail how Jon Jones owns most of those ranges in most of his fights. And that's the assignment. It's not when can you hit him and how can you hit him. It's how can you stop him from manipulating range.
And he also talked, John, about the fact that in that first fight, he felt tired. I think he was somewhat surprised by the wrestling of Jon Jones, and it was Jon that was able to take down Daniel Cormier. And I think you almost saw later in that fight, it almost became just a moral victory for Cormier working for that takedown, even though he was down on rounds at that point. Do you blow up the initial game plan? Are there elements Daniel Cormier can take from that first period of training for Jon Jones?
Certainly. The experience of being in there with Jon Jones and his fights afterwards, dealing with Anthony Johnson, dealing with Alexander Gustafsson. Robin and I were talking about the fact that, now Cormier knows what he can put himself through because Alexander Gustafsson, he made this a very difficult fight for Daniel Cormier, a hard fight that he had to endure a lot of pain and punishment. And Cormier now knows that he can get through that. So he can take a few more risks with Jon Jones, knowing that, my body can actually handle this. And, I got to go all in if I want to be able to defeat arguably the pound-for-pound best fighter ever in history.
Yeah, if you're studying fighters for inspiration, often you can study how they look at their perspective of something. When DC was talking about that fight, like you said, he looked at it and said it was important to be pushed that hard, so he knew how far he could be pushed. And then when Jones was talking about the OSP fight, he was talking about how it was important to have that fight because then he could realize that even though he only got touched twice, his expectations are high. That's a good problem to have. These people's perspective is finding the way to frame whatever they've been through as a way to seek improvement. Both these guys are doing this. You're going to see a lot of fascinating stuff from a psychological perspective leading into this fight. Some of it, how they treat each other and manipulate stories with each other and push each other's buttons, but also for how they find the inspiration in their own fights.
One other story to make mention of, and it's going to be an interesting one heading into the UFC's debut in Ottawa. It involves Stephen Thompson and Rory MacDonald and Bellator president Scott Coker. He has certainly made it public at this point that they will be very interested when Rory MacDonald's, it's the final fight of his contract against Stephen Thompson. He's going to be a very coveted free agent, in my opinion. And it seems that this is going to be something that is going to be a reoccurring theme throughout 2016 and beyond. Bellator is going to be very aggressive towards the Rory MacDonalds of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, it makes sense, but you also, when you look at the welterweight division of the UFC right now, you've Johny Hendricks, former champion, Robbie Lawler, the current champion, Stephen Thompson, all of those guys are into their 30s. Rory MacDonald, only 26 years of age. So you look at what the next 5 years looks like at the welterweight division, there's no guarantees that Johny Hendricks or Robbie Lawler are even going to be a part of it. It's not guaranteed, but based on everything we've seen, we know Rory's motivation. You would expect that he would still shine over the next 5 years. The UFC knows that. There's no way they can allow one of the top guys at 170 pounds, a guy essentially now that George St-Pierre isn't an active
This is
fighter.
the biggest one to come due in
yes.
recent memory. This is a much bigger one to me than even Benson Henderson.
All this is going to do is change where the high levels of pay is because Bellator will make an offer. Rory's going to go where the money is, and the UFC is going to match that offer. That's what's going to happen. Rory wants to get paid. He's going to be a father. He's one of the best fighters in the world. Bellator being out there and being open about saying, hey, we will pursue. They're careful not to, what's the word, meddle? What's the word? There's a legal term for something you're not allowed to do by going after somebody who's under contract, but they're making it public that they will do that if and when he's a free agent. As a result, the UFC knows it'll go up. Rory knows it'll go up. His pay's going up, but I think he'll stay with the UFC.
Yeah, it will be a very interesting topic heading into the UFC's card coming up in June, and you will hear much more from these two. It's Robin Black and John Ramdeen. Tune into 5 Rounds every Monday night, starting at a new time of 7 p.m. Eastern Time next week.